Paul writes to the Christians in Rome, and he writes to the Christians in Rome because he's helping them deal with a circumstance where you've got some prejudicial behavior. There was some mistreatment of the Gentiles on the part of the Jews, and then later on, probably some reverse discrimination where the Gentiles were treating the Jewish Christians badly. And Paul basically, in his letter to the Romans, tells them, look, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, everybody's got a sin problem. The only way to deal with your sin problem is to be forgiven, and you can't do that on your own. You've got to rely on God for that. Paul outlines in the book of Romans man's fallen state. In chapter 1, he's going to essentially say you hated God. You did not honor him. You did not acknowledge him. You did not thank him. And you exchanged his image for other images to be worshipped. And based on this behavior, the wrath of God was coming on all men. But God, through his mercy, God allowing us to live by faith and access his grace, was going to solve our sin problems. He'll go on and talk about the faith of Abraham. He'll talk about the righteousness of David, where David said, blessed is the man whom the Lord does not impute sin. And he brings his audience up to speed about their salvation. And when we pick up our discussion, we're going to be in what in the English Bible is the beginning of chapter 5. Although your Bible was not originally written in chapters and verses, he's in a long discussion, and he's reached one of his conclusion parts. Romans chapter 5, verse 1, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance, character, character, hope. Now, hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us. So Paul writes his audience and says, I want to remind you, therefore, we've got a conclusion here. You've been justified. Now, justified is a standing that says, I was found guilty, but I'm not going to be treated as if I'm guilty. I like to take the word justified and expand it just as if I'd never sinned. If you've ever experienced being pulled over by a police officer and not given a ticket, or you've been caught doing something but weren't punished, you didn't get away with anything, you're guilty, but the person treats you just as if you'd never sinned. So he tells his audience, you've been justified, and you've been justified by faith, and because of that faith, you now have peace with God. Now think about that. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They have fellowship with God. We draw the conclusion that God would come to them at a regular interval and walk and talk with them in the cool of the day. One day the presence of God is entering the garden, and Adam and Eve hide. When God asked Adam, why did you hide? One of the saddest verses in the Bible, Adam says, because I was afraid. Imagine. You've got this relationship and this fellowship with God that when he comes to visit, you run out to meet him like a child. And on this occasion, the presence of God enters and you're terrified. Well, faith and mercy and grace says you don't have to be afraid anymore. We not only are justified, but we have peace with God. That thing that makes us afraid, that thing that makes us unable to be in his presence, that thing that keeps us separated, that's been done away with. We now have peace with God, and we have access by faith into this grace, this God giving us what we need, not what we deserve. And so Paul says, you've got these blessings. You've been given these things. And then he adds in verse 3, and not only that. I'm almost overwhelmed with the verse, not only that. I mean, you've seen the info commercials. They have this thing and it promises to do all this. Buy this machine, sit it in your corner. You don't even have to get on it. Look at it and you'll lose weight and it'll do your taxes. But wait, there's more. That's what Paul is saying. You've been justified. You have peace with God. You have access to grace because of this faith. But wait, there's more. Not only that, not only do we have these things that deal with us on a spiritual level, but we've got some comfort and some assurity in our circumstances because we glory in tribulations, difficult circumstances, tribulations, problems, trials, temptations, difficulties. And glory, that word glory there means to shine. We outdo ourselves, or we show off a little bit. Not only do we have this resolution of our sinful condition, but now we're in a position that even when we experience tribulations, we actually glory, we actually shine. Now, what does he mean by that? Knowing that tribulation produces perseverance. Almost everything in the known universe reacts to stress by degrading. If you do so many factor one falls on a climbing rope, you've got to retire that rope. If you stress a winch cable or a high tension cable and you stress it with over pulling on it, at some point you've taxed it. If you take a vertical column and you load it horizontally, you'll stress that metal and it has to be retired. Everything in the known universe gets weaker under stress except you. See, God says you're designed so that when you encounter stress, you get perseverance. When you encounter stress, it builds your endurance. When you encounter stress, it causes you to be able to withstand the pain and continue to function. The idea of long suffering, the idea of perseverance, the idea of patience is not that you do these things and it doesn't hurt, but you can continue to do these things even though there might be some pain, even though there might be some difficulty. So Paul says you've got to understand that because of what God is doing in our lives, that equips us, that enables us, that when we encounter tribulation, the tribulation builds within us the ability of endurance or perseverance. Now, once we get perseverance, perseverance builds character. Character is the idea that I've been tested and I've been proven. It's almost like the concept of tempering a piece of metal. So you take a piece of metal and you expose it to heat and you expose it to pressure. You heat it up and you beat it in a blacksmith shop with a hammer on top of an anvil, and you fold it and you beat it and you heat it, and then you submerge it in either an oil bath or water, and you temper that steel. Good tempered steel is neither too soft nor too hard. On the Rockwell hardness rating between about 58 and 62, anything above 62 is brittle and will break. Anything below 58 is too malleable and it flexes. But in that sweet spot, that 58 to 62 on the Rockwell hardness scale, it is a tempered piece of metal that can withstand all kind of devastation. I think Buck used to advertise a knife that they could hammer into a tree and stand on it. Paul says by the time you've gone through the tempering process, by the time you've been exposed to the heat and the pressure and the beating and the folding, perseverance builds character, the temper, the idea of what you're made of. Now, once I have perseverance and once I have character, the byproduct of those two things is hope. Perseverance produces character, and character hope. And Paul will add and say in verse 5, now hope does not disappoint. Now the reason hope doesn't disappoint is because we have this measure. We have this ability to say, what can we use to gauge how much hope we have? And you've got to understand the biblical concept of hope is an earnest expectation of what God is going to do. This is not the idea of I hope I see a deer this year, or I hope I get a car when I turn 16. This is an expectation. The little kids in the car rider line. You know, you take those little elementary school kids and they bring them outside, and the parents line up in their cars. Those little guys aren't out there wringing their hands going, oh, I hope mom remembers to come get me. They're throwing rocks at the wasp nest and pulling people's hair and doing all kinds of silly things because they're not worried whether mom is coming. Expect mom to be there and pick them up in the car rider line. That's biblical hope. It's not the idea of if God is going to do something, but when God is going to do something and how big that is. I tell the story of being in Walmart one time when Lonnie Beth was little. And I'm like a kid. If I go to Walmart, I have to have snacks. Our particular Walmart had a McDonald's inside it. I think now they have Subways, but in those days it was a McDonald's, and we were sitting in the little booth in the McDonald's and eating our Happy Meals and our French fries, and these guys came in and they were cowboys. Now this is on the western side of Huntsville near Limestone County. And these were real cowboys. I think there was the Limestone County Sheriff's Rodeo or something was in town. And these guys came walking in, and you could tell they weren't dressing in costumes. These were real cowboys. Their hats looked like they'd been rolled up and slapped against livestock. They had tattered jeans. They had that long, rangy look. Their boots looked like the heels had been scrubbed, where they had roped an animal and had resisted by digging their heels in the ground. And one of these young men walking into this McDonald's was a bull rider. And you could tell he was a bull rider. My cousin in Kansas says you can look at a guy's spurs, and if he has a pin in the little wheel on the back, then he's a bull rider. You don't want to be on a bull and dig those spurs and have them roll. They put a pin in there to keep it from rotating. It allows you to stay connected to the bull better. Well, this young man walks in, and just something about him. You just knew he was a bull rider. He's wearing his T-shirt, and the T-shirt on the front said, Bull Rider. I don't know if I mentioned that I'm a psychologist. I'm a counselor, actually, but I know things about human nature. Well, this bull rider allowed me to figure out this kid was a bull rider. And on the back of his shirt, it said, not if, but when, and how bad. This young man understood his sport. If you get on a 2,500-pound animal and you challenge it and say, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, you can't throw me off, at some point the bull wins. It's not if you get hurt, but when you get hurt and how bad you get hurt. I was at a youth rally in Mississippi one time, and one of the guys sitting at the table at lunch was a rodeo guy, and he just casually said, well, the third time I broke my elbow, I don't have to break my elbow 3 times to know I'm in the wrong sport. These guys who ride these large animals understand that risk is part of the deal. And it's not if you get hurt, but when you get hurt, and how bad will you get hurt riding bulls. Well, similarly, it's hope is not if, but when and how big. God is going to be involved in our lives, and God is going to do something in our lives, and God is going to respond to us in tribulation because He's given us faith. He's allowed us to have grace and mercy. We're justified. We have peace. And because of those things, our tribulations produce perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out into our lives. You see, when Paul talks about hope and talks about an earnest expectation, Paul says you can have this expectation that God is going to do something, and you can gauge what God is going to do based on what God has done. And what has God done? God poured out His love into our lives. So when something happens, when a bad circumstance happens, you can't say, hey, God doesn't love me. No, God's on record for having loved you. Your house burns down, you get diagnosed with cancer, the storm comes in and blows things away. You can't say, I can't believe this is happening to me. How can God let this happen? God's on record that He loves you. The love of God has been poured out into our hearts. And it's the idea that God gave His love toward us as proof of how He feels about us. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. The love of God is a constant in the universe. Now, your behavior will indicate whether or not you love God, but it doesn't change God's love for us. So Paul says you've got tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And the idea behind hope is not if, the idea is when. Well, how do you know that God's going to be active? Well, God's already been active. When you had a sin problem, God poured out His love into your heart. And our gauge, our metric for measuring hope is based in measuring the love of God. And when you start talking about the love of God, now you're talking about in any circumstance that I have an immeasurable resource that allows me to rely on the love and the mercy and the providence of God to address that situation. And I think sometimes we want to limit God. I think sometimes we want to let God be in charge of our soul, but not let God be in charge of our finances. We want to let God be in charge of our salvation, but we don't let God be in charge of our marriage. We don't let God be in charge of our salvation, but we don't let God be in charge of our diagnosis. And no matter what the circumstance is, God's already said tribulation produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. My earnest expectation that God is active in my life. How do I measure that? I measure that by the love of God. Several years ago, I spoke at a small country church in Gurley, Alabama. Gurley. Now, the minister in Gurley, Alabama at the time was a gentleman named Jim Ashworth. And I moved to Huntsville. Jim Ashworth was old. I don't know how old Jim Ashworth actually was. The rumor was that Jim Ashworth is so old that people in heaven think he didn't make it. Okay? So Brother Ashworth is at this little congregation. And so I go over there to speak like on a Wednesday night. And you may not know this, but people pay their speakers. It's kind of a brotherhood secret, I think, because this phenomenon of paying the guest speaker is kind of a secret thing. You know, nobody just walks up and says, well, hey, we appreciate the fact that Lonnie did this lesson and Lonnie put in, X number of hours to prepare it, and he's left his home church to be here, and he's traveled all night, and now he's speaking, and because of that, we're going to reimburse him and give him some. We don't do that. We have what I call the deacon in charge of the drug deal. You've got this guy that walks out into the foyer when you're shaking everybody else's hands, or he walks up when nobody else is around, and he kind of looks sideways. And he makes eye contact with you, kind of nods his head. And then you look at him, and he looks at you, and you walk up and you shake hands, and it's a real and then all of a sudden you've got something in your pocket, and you've been paid. I call him the deacon in charge of the drug deal. So I speak at this little church, and I'm standing in the back, and we're shaking hands, and I'm talking to people, and this really tall dude kind of starts circling me like Jaws. He's moving around the foyer. I can even hear that music. No. And he makes eye contact with me. I make eye contact with him. I realize this is the guy with the check. This is the deacon in charge of the drug deal. So I look up to the side, and he looks to the side, and I look at him, and he looks at me, and we nod. We shake hands. Boom, I got a check. Put it in my pocket. Well, I get home that night, and I'm clearing out my pocket. I take my pager off. This is back when pagers were a thing. I take my pager off. I take my wallet out, bring my keys out. I bring this little check out, and I unfold it, and I look at it. And Jackie said, well, how did you do? And I said, well, I don't know. She said, what do you mean you don't know? I said, well, I either really did an outstanding job or I did a terrible job. She said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, they gave me a blank check. She laughed and said, a blank check? I said, yeah, it was either really so good they were just blown away, they didn't know what to do, or I was so bad they were ashamed of it and said, I don't know what to do with this guy. She said, we've got a blank check. I said, yeah, we got a blank check. She said, well, do you think we need to pay off the house or pay off the cars? I said, I don't know. I'll call Jim Ashworth in the morning and ask him. So we got up the next day, and I waited, give Jim time to get up, get in the office, and I made a phone call. Hey, Brother Ashworth, this is Lonnie Jones. Oh, hello, Brother Lonnie. I said, I need to talk to you about the check I got last night. He goes, well, what's wrong? Did it bounce? I said, no, Brother Jim, I ain't even been to the bank. I said, the problem I've got is you guys gave me a blank check. And my wife wants to know if we should pay off the house or pay off the car. And this old, wise saint chuckled. And he said, Brother Lonnie, if you really believed it was a blank check, you pay them both off. See, the hope that God has given us is that blank check. I don't have to limit God to this or this. God does it all. And when I encounter difficult circumstances, my faith says I've been justified. I have peace with God. I have access by faith into this grace. Any circumstance that I encountered, any tribulation will produce perseverance. Perseverance will produce character, and character will produce hope. How do I know that? Because I measure hope, what God is going to do based on what God has done. He poured out His love into our hearts. Verse 6, for when we were yet sinners, for when we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, and perhaps for a good man someone even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You see, what Paul promised his audience is that no matter what your circumstances are, you've got to look at what God has done for us. And what God has done for us is a measure and a gauge of what God will do for us. Now, if God would give us his Son, is there a limit to what he'll do to help us in our difficult circumstances? Our faith in difficult circumstances basically is rooted in the fact not what God's going to do to us, but what God has done for us. Been justified. I have peace with God. I have access by faith into grace. And Paul says you measure the hope of God because of this sentence right here. Verse 5, now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. Scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God made preparations for us to be saved. God did his act of mercy when we weren't on God's side. God treated us the way he did when we were at enmity with God. Now, if God would do this for us when we were at odds, what will God do for us? What will God help us get through while we're his children? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's a demonstration of God's love. God's love in the past is the way we gauge our hope for the future. What God has done for us predicts what God will do for us. Not if, but when and how big. God bless you.